a really important partnership with CNA Foundation through Save the Citizen Switzerland, and has really allowed us to do a lot of new things in terms of research moving forward, urban DRR and comprehensive school safety in education for Save the Children. It's really, I mean, the aims of the whole research suite is to improve the quality of urban child-centered DRR and education programs through the use of evidence, to change how we use evidence and learning, especially within the disaster risk reduction and education sector, and also to really improve both internal and external practitioners' operation and how we and they do things in urban DRR and education worldwide. And this is the sort of first presentation of research which we really think is allowing us to get there and reach the aims of what we want to achieve. I would also state at the beginning that there's three broad themes that this research covers. One is on policy in the enabling environment, another is on hazard impacts on education, and the third is on solutions for child-centered DRR and comprehensive school safety. And this research, which we're going to go through today, sits under theme 3 on solutions for child-centered DRR and comprehensive school safety, and it's really allowing good practices, methods, tools, and approaches to be investigated, developed, and which we can then use to scale up our child-centered DRR program in urban settings, but also the comprehensive school safety work as it relates to education as well. And so throughout the next couple of months, you'll see much more output and information coming from the Asia Regional Office on these three topic areas. And so this first research is very much looking at child-centered hazard, vulnerability, and capacity assessments, and how we use those in urban areas. And it's based on the idea that hazard, vulnerability, and capacity assessments are at the heart of how we do urban risk assessments, and is really the basis for DRR programs worldwide. And we really wanted to understand a number of questions related to this, including at a very basic level, understanding what are the different tools for this fundamental sort of risk assessment in urban areas out there, and how do we navigate and prioritize which ones to use and adapt for our programs, especially from a child-centered point of view, as Save the Children has. And so we set out this research, and luckily enough, it was commissioned with the Overseas Development Institute and ODI, and we really wanted to share the findings of this scoping study with you, as essentially as it's being released at the moment. And from ODI today on this webinar, we have John Twigg, who's familiar to many of you, and I think has been a leading voice, or the leading voice in a lot of cases, on disaster risk reduction, and has influenced a lot of the work we've done. So we're very fortunate that we have John Twigg on the call today, but also that he's been engaged in this research. And before I hand over to him, what I would ask is that if anybody has any questions, and they may come up through the presentation, if you can write them in the conversation box. We've allocated around half an hour to 40 minutes for presentation, and then we have some time afterwards for questions and answers, and we'll try and answer as many questions as we can during this session, but we'll also try and follow up with anything which we may not be able to answer. So I think with that said, I'd like to hand over to John to begin his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Karimi. Hello, everybody, whatever time of day it is where you are. It's morning in the UK. It's quite difficult talking to a group of people I can't see. So if it sounds as if I'm being a bit flat, it's because I normally rely on people's expressions to know whether I'm saying the right thing or not. We bid for this project. We put together a team of 4 people. Myself, as Karimi said, I work on DRR. I've also done a lot of work around vulnerability and capacity assessment tools. Matthew McClure is a specialist in working with children and young people. Virginie Lemasson, who works on social inclusion as well as disaster risk reduction. And Gianfranco Gliozzo from UCL, who works on information technologies. I'm not going to talk about the new technology aspect of the work. It was a sort of add-on to the project, but if anybody wants to ask questions about it later on, I'm happy to answer those. Can I have the next slide? Can I move it myself? Thank you. So we had a very clear brief from Save the Children about what we should be doing. We should be reviewing existing methods, tools, toolkits, and so on to assess their effectiveness and limitations in assessing hazards, vulnerabilities, and capacities with regard to children's vulnerabilities and capacities. And we were interested in looking at practices related particularly to child-centered or child-led DRR. There's a whole wealth of work and application of VCA that doesn't focus on that, some of which was relevant to this work and some of which wasn't. And in particular, we wanted to complement the study of the tools and the toolkits themselves with some understanding of how they're used. A tool is only as effective as the people who are utilizing it. So we wanted to understand how different stakeholders approached HVCA. What were their roles? What actions did they take? How did they view the tools they used or the way they used them? And what were their capacities? We've written the report, the scoping study report and needs assessment, which is being copy edited now and should be available very, very soon. I mean, the next few days, I hope. We also produced something called a research into practice brief at the beginning of the project, which is effectively a literature review, which I think is also going to be available to everybody. So if this presentation seems a little bit short and superficial, there's a lot more weight in those documents which will give you background and more detail. And I'm happy to answer further questions after this workshop by email if anybody wants to engage in discussion about it. Next slide, please. Okay, a little bit about how we did the work. We had a relatively limited amount of time, sufficient to get a pretty good understanding of the subject, but not a hugely comprehensive piece of research. It involved two different parts. The first was a review of the existing toolkits as documents, and we reviewed 20 toolkits. Which we identified through searching the literature or through talking to key informants and getting them to advise us or refer them. And those tools and toolkits were designed by a really wide range of organizations, mostly by NGOs, but also by others. And the second sort of parallel activity was to talk to practitioners about how they use these tools. We carried out 23 key informant interviews with a a really wide range of mostly NGO practitioners and some researchers who had experiences of either developing or particularly using HVCA tools. And some of those were urban practitioners, and most of our key informants were in Asia. A lot of them obviously were Save the Children staff, but we used snowball sampling to identify other people who we ought to be talking to. Each interview was semi-structured and lasted maybe an hour or so, sometimes longer. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, and the next slide, because that one doesn't really tell you very much, does it? What did we find? I'll come to this particular table in a moment. If you've worked with HVCA tools and toolkits, you'll know that they vary enormously in the scope, what they cover, the way in which they approach it. And it was no surprise that the 20 toolkits that we looked at covered a very wide range of contexts. Some focused on communities, some on urban areas, and others on school environment, for example, or other environments. Only 4 of those 20 kits focused exclusively on urban areas, and 6 were child-centered. The sort of the odd one out, the anomaly in this set, was Save the Children's Urban Situational Analysis Toolkit and Guidelines, USAT, which was still under development at the time we were doing the work, and we weren't able to review it in great depth because a copy was only available to us right in the late stages of the research. It's not specifically an HVCA tool, but it is very closely linked to it. And a lot of the tools it uses are very similar. We've produced, as part of our report, a matrix of toolkits. It's a big spreadsheet. It's pretty unreadable, but it's very useful to refer to, in which we've itemized each document that we looked at. We've given a web link to it so you can download it and look at it yourself, and we make some points about its method and its scope and its coverage and so on. So that's a reference work which you can all have access to. In general, although there was a lot of diversity, most of the toolkits used pretty much the same set of tools, and as you can see from that table. They're very largely those that are familiar to people who've done PRA, PLA work and so on, or have worked in any kind of participatory vulnerability context. So there was no real surprise there. Can I go on to the next slide, please? But what was interesting was that there wasn't much evidence that these tools were targeting or focusing on risks and vulnerabilities that might be more specific to urban contexts. In other words, they're very general tools. So there wasn't a lot of thought that was given to particular hazards, not just the physical hazards, but other sort of social hazards and so on that you might get in urban contexts. And the frameworks didn't really seem to address that. Individuals using those frameworks might do so, but by and large the tools themselves weren't geared to that. And we felt, certainly from the conversations and from reading the documents, that there was scope for more clarity in understanding about what risks and vulnerabilities might be, sort of, if you like, distinctly or specifically urban, and that might need to be targeted or analysed. There was generally a belief amongst the key informants we spoke to that more could be done to construct a comprehensive urban toolkit. A lot of the tools that were being used were designed, because they'd come out of rural participatory work, were designed for use with relatively small groups and where a fairly high level of participation could be guaranteed. it was often much harder to do that in urban context, and the toolkits didn't necessarily provide methods or guidance on how to do that. We also noticed that there wasn't much discussion around climate change adaptation. I know there's an ongoing debate about where DRR starts and finishes and where climate change adaptation starts and finishes, which is important, but there seems to be a lot of uncertainty amongst users about exactly how they're applying the tools to each, or where the overlaps or the differences lie. Next slide, please. HVCAs tended to overlook, as I said, the social threats to children. They were, again, I think because of their origins, there was a strong, if you like, natural hazards focus. Not even so much technological hazards, but certainly natural hazards focus. And so other issues tended to be overlooked. Next slide, please. And some groups who were thought to be most at risk, like street children, like child labourers, didn't seem to be identified through the assessments themselves. They seem to have been identified as through project implementation. And the focus on poverty, while important in itself, meant that there was a possibility that children living in medium or high income areas might not be covered, even though physically they were more exposed to risks, urban hazard. I mean, say earthquake risk or landslide risk or something like that. So, I suppose to sum up, I'd say that there's a need for a much more careful thinking about just what problems these tools are being applied to, who they're looking at, and what kind of issues are going to be highlighted. And I'll come back to this question about choice and thinking through later on. Next slide, please. We had a lot of feedback about children's voice. It didn't seem to be the tools themselves, the formal tools, didn't seem to offer much possibility for children's voice. It didn't seem to think about that as an issue. And so where that was promoted, it depended much more on actually the commitment, the knowledge, the understanding and insights of individual staff who were involved. And there was a sense, I wasn't involved in the interviews myself, other members of the team did that, but there was the sense that came out of the interviews that children didn't seem to be recognised as agents of change in urban areas in the same way that we're thinking about them as agents of change around DRR and adaptation in rural areas. So that's an area that I think needs a little bit more investigation. What was also clear was that the consultation with children and other stakeholders didn't necessarily turn into involvement in project activities, or at least into substantial involvement. Some tools were better at that than others. So the USAT tool did seem to put more emphasis on being kind of flexible and reflective during the assessment process. But there are clearly questions about how we work with urban communities in general as well. Can I have the next slide, please? One problem that was particularly noticed in urban context was that a lot of communities seemed to be tired, in a sense. I think that they'd had intervention fatigue. They didn't see the focus of an HVCA as particularly relevant to them amidst all the other priorities they faced. There was also, I mean, the suggestion from some interviews that one or two people we spoke to said, well, you don't really have urban communities, which of course isn't true. But they were thinking that they couldn't define an urban community as easily as they could define a rural community. It's much less visible geographically, it's much more dispersed and varied. So there's clearly, whatever tools are used and however they're used, there needs to be some quite serious thinking about what kind of community or communities is it that a project or an intervention or an assessment is looking at. And related to that was how one engages with the often informal groups that are very active in governance in urban areas. Local authorities can be quite difficult to work with because of the layers of bureaucracy, and because it's often quite difficult to get to the real decision makers. But in parallel, there are also lots of informal decision making mechanisms and localized self-governance, which are sometimes difficult to identify. And beyond that, there was an issue about how you interrogate the underlying motivations of different stakeholders, and who may or may not be interested in the work you're doing, who may have their own particular reasons for preserving the status quo rather than seeking change. And more thought needed to go into that. Next slide, please. So to sum up, our assessment felt that whereas we'd probably started at the beginning by thinking about should there be a new and improved tool or set of tools or toolkit, our review of those that were already out there, that were already available, and our assessment of how they were being used suggested that actually producing another toolkit wasn't going to be helpful. There's plenty of good tools out there already. And they're already familiar to most people. A lot of the basic research tools in the field are already in existence, and many people know how to use them. So the challenge is how you use them more effectively. What's needed is more emphasis on how to select and modify those particular tools and toolkits to deal with specific situations and specific contexts. So you need flexibility, choices about what tools to use or adapt, but it needs to be a deliberative process. You need to think about why you're making those choices and what's the reason for it. You know, what are the assumptions? What are the constraints? What's the context? And we also felt that, particularly at country programme level, staff need to be given the freedom to do that. They have a lot of field experience, a lot of knowledge. Sometimes they don't want another new toolkit or set of guidelines coming down from central offices. They actually want to have the space to customise what's already there to their own needs and their own beneficiary groups. So we suggested an alternative approach. Can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, we can go on from that one, actually. Next one. We felt it would be more useful to create a process tool. In other words, a mechanism for actually reviewing the process, for dealing with those kind of questions that I've just mentioned. Now, the next slides in this series run through that in some detail. I'm not going to talk about it in detail, but I will just go through some of the points in it. So can I have the next slide, please, Jeremy? Okay. So the basic approach is to focus on decision-making processes rather than think about the specific tools themselves, which are part of that. Make users of all kinds think about the decisions they're making during that process, because they are making decisions, they're just not always being conscious of it. And the idea of thinking about process is, of course, you can apply it to lots of different tools or toolkits and lots of different operational contexts. And it does ensure some kind of consistency, that there's a deliberative decision-making process that everyone can go through, and that can be applied at any stage during the project cycle, whether it's beforehand during the planning, or whether it's while monitoring the work, or whether it's in review or evaluation afterwards. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, I don't want to go through the tool in details, but we set out, and this was in the end a desk exercise amongst the team, based on all the hours and hours of interview transcripts that we've gone through. We came up with 34 questions that could be asked. Some of them related to setting objectives and planning what the tool should consist of. So its aim and purpose, thematic priorities, particular issues, how much information might be needed, what the outcomes and purpose would be, who would be making the decisions, what kind of resources and capacities were available, what skills. We had 14 questions on methodology, some of which were kind of more fundamental, some of which less so perhaps. So which groups had been chosen? Who was this exercise intended to help, and why? What's the domain of the HVCA? Is it in a school? Is it in a particular municipality? Is it in a particular type of community, geographical location, or so on? And why was that chosen? What are the contexts, the social context, the political contexts, etc., and what risks and vulnerabilities would be considered? Taking an all risks perspective is a huge amount of work. If you're going to narrow it down to particular risks and vulnerabilities, then what's the rationale for doing that? How would the tool or the approach capture underlying risk factors? So not the immediate hazards and harms, but the underlying institutional, political, cultural perhaps issues which might affect that. So poverty, discrimination, land rights, issues like that. Would the assessment consider power structures, power relationships and their influence? What assessment methods and tools would be available in terms of trained staff, resources, etc.? Would it consider vulnerabilities and capacities of children and young people in relation to other socio-economic factors, gender or disability or ethnicity? And how would it link to other tools and assessments? Because there are always assessments of one kind or another being carried out, probably with the same target groups, or in the neighbouring localities. What was the role or purpose of the tools selected? Why are you doing that? Is there a need to customise anything? What tools have you chosen not to use for whatever reason, whether it's lack of skills, lack of resources, lack of time, or so on? And what are the implications of all of that? We had 6 questions on participation, voice and empowerment, partly about team structure, decisions that were being made about about purpose, approach and methods. How are those made? Who's making those decisions? Who has the authority? Who's participating in the community? How do they participate? How genuinely participatory is the process? There are lots of different levels of participation, as we all know. Is the exercise child-centred or participatory or child-led? How are children's voices being heard? Who's listening to them? Are there any voices that aren't being heard? And who's being empowered through this whole process? And then when it comes to results and evaluation, we'd want to interrogate how reliable is the evidence? What are the strengths and weaknesses? How useful is the knowledge? Who's going to use it? What's it going to be used for? Are there issues that haven't been addressed? There are always issues that haven't been addressed and questions that haven't been answered. And how would we measure overall the quality and the success of the assessment? And then in terms of outcomes, who's going to use the results? What are they going to use them for? What actions followed? And what did they achieve? And what was learned from it? And how was that learning shared? Next slide, please. I think the next slides actually are all related to the detailed questions which I've gone through. Can you go through to the last slide? Yeah, I think that's the end. And I think that focus on outcomes and what comes at the end of the process is really important. A lot of these HVCAs tend to just focus on the process and the results. And I've seen so many assessment reports that have just been piled up in people's offices and not being used particularly, but also not being reviewed and compared with others later on. They get forgotten very quickly. So how do you make this knowledge live and growing and expanding and developing and questioning is also, I think, a key question and something you might want to explore during the discussion. I think that's the end of my presentation. As I said, I'm happy to answer any questions you've got. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that, John. That was actually very interesting and very useful to see, I guess, the process you guys went through and some of the outcomes and I guess the change of direction from where we first started to something a bit more, I guess, fit for purpose in the end. I'm just reading through, so we've got some time for questions, and Nick, I'm not sure if your one was a question which you'd put on intervention fatigue.
No, it wasn't, but I do have another question.
Okay,
if I may.
Great. Yes, so I'd like to open up for anyone who has questions to come forward. And go ahead, Nick.
So, John, thank you very much for the presentation. That's great. And it's been a real pleasure to have you and your team working on this over the past months. It's been, it's a great report you've produced, and it's plenty of food for thought. My question for you is really around that balance between individual risk and collective risk. So at the beginning of the presentation, you talked about all these other urban risks that people face, like air pollution, traffic, drugs, and so forth. One of the things we're grappling with the second part of this sort of study is, or turning it into the tool, developing this process tool, is where do you draw the lines? Where do you draw the boundaries between the sorts of risks that you can realistically address through these processes in terms of the actions you take afterwards? And what are the things that are maybe too individual in nature, which are going to be difficult to address? So I'd be really interested to hear if you have any thoughts between that balance of sort of individual risk versus collective risk and how they can be addressed through a process tool for HVCA.
Yeah, that's a really challenging question, actually, and it wasn't talked about particularly during the key informant interviews, but it was implied in a lot of what was being said. People were having to make those decisions one way or another operationally. I don't know where you draw the line. I think the problem being that, of course, you can't address all the risks, so you have to make a decision in a sense of where your cutoff point is going to be, and I think that will depend entirely on, firstly, who's undertaking this exercise and what purpose they're undertaking it for and what outcomes they want to have, but also how willing they are to question themselves. I think a lot of, in my experience anyway, a lot of NGOs go into these situations saying, oh yeah, we can deal with all the problems, and that's actually, that can be quite damaging, because communities expect them to come and deal with all the problems, and in the end they're quite selective. I think transparency is important here. I think transparency in the decisions that you make as a field team, in terms of what you're going to focus on and why, which might be for a lot of different reasons, some of them entirely to do with practicalities or resources or something like that, or there may be other motives. Transparent with themselves as a team, and also transparent with the communities they work with. I think that's the really key bit. I think there's always a danger that participants in these exercises can be misled into thinking that much more is going to result from them than actually does. Does that answer the question? Not really, but it's...
Yeah, it sort of answers the question, but for everybody else on the line, it's great to see so many. I think that's something that we still need to grapple with. I think we all know instinctively that there are so many issues around child protection that as an organization we gravitate towards to address, but in the context of the way that we design and deliver programs, we also, for want of a better description, have to dance to the tune of the donor, who are put some parameters around what we do, but how do we push those parameters to really be able to address what those communities are articulating and needing, and as you say, John, to make sure we're not raising expectations beyond what we can deliver against, but still, you know, do what the donor wants, try to respond to the communities and find that balance. I think it's going to be a consistent juggling act, frankly.
I think that's right, and I think that's why we specifically focused on acknowledging that, because it often isn't. And I think that's the point about transparency, that you have to make decisions, whatever you're doing in your juggling act, and you have to be clear with yourselves about what decisions you've made and why, and accept that you're not going to get an optimal solution necessarily. The danger with a lot of VCA reports that I've looked at is that they tend to blur that, so they imply they're delivering more than they're actually going to, and that's frustrating for everybody involved.
Great. Thanks for that. Are there any more questions?
Hello, everybody. That's Christoph speaking. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, Christoph.
So, hello, John. Hello, everybody. Nice to hear you. And thanks, John, for this presentation. I think it's really useful and it's really addressing the key issues we are facing when we want to understand risks. And basically, it's along the same line of thoughts, like what sort of risk we want to pick up, collective, individual risks, and so it's more a question to maybe to the Save the Children ESD team, but my understanding is all this research have a focus on education and safe education. Safe learning environment. And I mean, so first, is it really looking at how education and our work and how school could be a place where risks are mitigated, and if yes, maybe that would narrow down the big questions about what sort of risk and what can we do about that. And the second one is if we talk about disasters, I believe in essence they are collective. So having those two preliminary questions, if it's really about disasters, it's really helping to narrow down the scope of risks. And if it's about education, it's again further narrowing down the solutions. So basically that's my question. I mean, I think it's a great tool that could be applied. I could see when you look at individual risk, that could be a tool that people working on child protection can definitely use. But then they have to take a different, I guess, direction. So have you, when you did your research, have you kept the scope of it's about disasters and it's about education?
Our terms of reference were to look at whatever toolkits were out there, effectively, to look at the whole range. The program as itself, the overall research program clearly has an educational focus. Some of the toolkits were more closely linked, I would say, to schools and education. But I think there's room for more discussion about just how you sort of pull that together as a focus. I would see what we did as if you like, a first step in starting to ask those questions. Perhaps using some of the questions we've already put in the process toolkit and saying, well, actually, what's going to be relevant in that sense. Again, it's largely about saying, well, there isn't a one-size-fits-all method, but there's also a danger that very, very specific methods don't have any wider use. So questioning the entire process is really valuable.
Thanks for that. I guess I had maybe a follow-up on that and a question after. And I would say that in terms of the scope, we really, I guess, we put a sort of a hazard and disaster focus in terms of what we were looking at. And I would say while a lot of the research is education focused, it's not all entirely looking at just education. I think it's a major lens that's involved, but this whole element on urban risk as a wider agenda point and urban child-centered DRR, I think, is also trying to not just focus on education alone, but look at the wider risks. And maybe, I guess my question, John, would be, I think you pointed out a lot of the, I guess, the limitations in I guess, some of the tools missing certain elements in terms of children's voice, when you were talking about the process tool needing to have a focus on, when you're having a focus on the questions on sort of issues on poverty, discrimination, even issues such as land rights, and I was wondering, in terms of the matrix that was developed, does this point to where some tools are better than others at this, or in some of the areas which may be lacking, which you've sort of identified as core areas? Are there tools which we should be referring to, and has this sort of research identified those?
That's quite a difficult question to answer, actually, because if you read a formal manual or guidelines for a particular tool or toolkit, they're all quite generic, actually. I mean, there are one or two that are applied to very specific contexts, but by and large, they're all quite similar. So they're all laying out what the tool might do. There's a huge, and we do in the matrix. All we can do is in a sense describe that and capture that. You know, the scope of it, the kind of tools that are there within the toolkit, and so on, and any recognised constraints or operational factors that are associated with it. What we don't know, and that's why we had to do the key informant interviews, was to say, well, actually, how are those tools used in practice? I mean, I've been looking at VCA for quite a long time, and there's a huge variation in the way different users will deploy different tools. That knowledge of what actually happens on the ground is actually quite difficult to obtain sometimes, and that's why we did some of the interviews. I'm worried that people take a particular tool or toolkit and they just apply it according to the book without thinking about those particular contextual issues. And that again it comes back to why we felt it was important that people were starting to question what they were doing. Sorry, I'm getting a lot of interference on the lines. That's better. Sorry, can you still hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay. So it is, yeah. So I mean, fundamentally, it's all about use. It's all about application on the ground, and I think maybe we do need to know more about that. It would be, I mean, it would be really interesting to actually accompany project teams on the ground when they're doing these exercises, and to listen to the conversations and to see how they're applying the tools and reflecting on how they do it. We were only getting that at kind of arm's length, if you like, through the interviews. And not many of the people, most of the people we were talking to were kind of middle and higher levels. It'd be really interesting to talk to project workers about how they understand that. And I think those views were what was missing in our research.
This is Ray. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Yes, John, thank you for this very crisp and enriching presentation. Also the comprehensive review and summary. While the hazard, vulnerability, capacity, or we use more the word PVCA, participatory vulnerability capacity analysis, is a very strong foundation when we initiate. And also you have made a comment about how these tools do not really touch the issue of what Sendai framework says. We see children and youth as agents of change. So while this foundation tool review is very useful, do we have other progressive tools in the same arena of what we call PVC or HVCA that you have encountered, which will help us, say, after a year, after 2 years? Sometimes our resilience work takes minimum 3 to 6 years. So do we have other progressive tools, especially to map and work, as it builds up?
That's an interesting question. I think, well, the two answers to it. One is that I think most of what people need in terms of tools is already available. The issues are that they've got to use them critically. They've got to use them thoughtfully and understand what they're doing with them, why they're doing that, and how effective it is. So that's one point, which is why we talked about process so much. The second point is that VCAs tend to be a one-off. It's done at the beginning of a project, and that's it. It's forgotten. And I can't off the top of my head, and I think of a single example where a VCA exercise has been repeated later on after some years of intervention to see what's changed. There are project evaluations, but they don't necessarily adopt the same format. They can be quite different. And that's often about delivery of projects. So I think it would be very interesting to do a series of assessments using similar methodologies over a period of time to understand what changes. And that isn't done. And that's I think just because of resources, actually. It's quite an expensive exercise to do a VCA. And depends on the scale, and if it's participatory, it's very time consuming and so on. A lot of agencies simply don't have the resources to do so.
Hello.
Hi.
Yeah, John, very interesting points you have raised. And coming back to your the mentioning about the baseline and the end line, the tools which you have evaluated are the primary tools to understand the basic situation, or are some of them really reflect on the midterm evaluation or end term evaluation or impact assessment? Because for example, we are working on the urban situation analysis toolkit, the guide in the toolkit, which primarily focusing on getting what is the situation right now, and which will help develop the programming. So my question is that what is your suggestion that how to go about when you are developing a tool from the scratch? Because it's a very scientific exercise, which you rightly pointed out that what you exactly want from this particular research, and in what context, whether it's a baseline, midline, or endline. So what's your suggestion then how to go about on developing tools?
I think, well, I suppose let's just think about the key difference between tools and toolkits. There are lots and lots of different tools, participatory tools and some other tools that are available for collecting and analyzing information. The toolkits are collections of particular tools. And the idea behind a toolkit is that you should be choosing which tools are most relevant. I think it comes back to choice. I think all the tools are there. I think what's needed is as I tried to say earlier, is that people need to make a very thoughtful choice about which tools they are using and why, and what they're using them for. I think all the and that will depend on their capacities and skills and so on, as well as on the particular context and the particular needs and so forth. But I do think it is actually. I think all that yeah, well, that tool material is already there. It's a question of how people make those choices that's important. I don't think we need new tools. I don't think we need new tools developed necessarily. Maybe we do, but not fundamentally, no. And that's part of the problem. Is often people feel they need to go back to the beginning and start all over again.
John, Kevin Ronan here with a question.
Hi.
First of all, thanks very much for the presentation. It was fantastic and really enjoyed your report and your research into practice brief. I guess related to this line of discussion, the idea of a process tool that allows one to pick and choose from, as it was referred to, from baseline to end line is a useful kind of idea. And the current toolkits, though, do seem to stop at doing an assessment that leads them to some decisions about planning for the project, but not an ongoing monitoring process.
Yeah.
And I think a process-based tool, it really follows sort of a step logic kind of model that can go from, to use the expression, woe to go, that can really allow for decisions about how does one, once an assessment is translated into action, how does one then monitor that action, and then how does one then take that project and move from it being a one-off project to moving towards implementation in other contexts. And I think that process tool allows for that development over time, that within those steps in that kind of logic sequence, then one could insert various monitoring mechanisms that are suitable for a particular context. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's all about how the organisation is choosing to do this. I don't think, yeah, as I said, I think there is it's partly because again it's the time and resources that go into pre-project assessments, and the limited budgets that just don't allow people to follow through that kind of logic, and to do that kind of analysis. And I think we need to be upfront about that. I've worked in the NGO sector, and you do get cut off. People are afraid to say it because it implies they haven't done their job properly. But actually, the truth is that with the resources at their disposal, that's probably the best they can do. I just think we need to be more honest with ourselves and maybe with other people about that.
Yeah, I fully agree, and I think that going forward, that in a process kind of model like that rather than going with the ivory tower gold standard type of thinking, it's really about pragmatics that meet a certain threshold of reliability, validity, and so forth, but that are easier to use. So when I think about ongoing monitoring of an intervention, whether in my trade, clinical psychology, or in a DRR type of context, we're always thinking pragmatic before we're thinking ivory tower. So I think that's really important. I agree.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. Conscious of time, I think so. There was 2 written questions, and I may just raise those with John quickly to see if he had a quick response or answer. One was, and I guess which was in the mapping, if there was any issues related to conflict or terrorism in urban settings, and I guess if those sort of came up, and I guess the other was picking up on the question that you mentioned at the beginning, was leveraging new technology opportunities and how that could be done.
Okay. In answer to the first one, I mean, there's absolutely no reason why conflict and terrorism in urban settings shouldn't be mentioned or viewed or analysed. I don't think I would need to go back and check, but I don't think they did appear in the toolkits that we saw, or particularly in the conversations that we had with key informants. Actually, I would need to check. It didn't come out. It didn't come out in the report, so I'm guessing it wasn't that strong in the interviews either. That's a really good point, and I think that's an area certainly humanitarians are starting to get much more concerned about. It's levels of violence in urban settings. And maybe there is a need to think more about that in all its different ramifications, from sort of household violence right up to more widespread conflict. I think that's a good point. On new technologies, we actually recruited a specialist on new technologies to look at this and do a bit of a literature review for us, because we didn't really have the expertise within the team, and he was very cautious. Actually, he didn't come in and say there are lots of wonderful new gadgets and gizmos and methods that you can use. He said actually it's really important to be very careful about technology and not to put your faith in it. It's a bit like seeing it as a new wonder tool that's going to solve all your problems, and you apply it without thinking about how you're using it, what you're using it for, etc., etc. So you're almost going to repeat some of the problems which have happened with more conventional HVCA. His suggestion was that it's something that needs to be reviewed, but particularly from the perspective of how are different stakeholders already picking up on different kinds of technologies and applying it for use. So in other words, looking at what's happening in particular contexts, rather than thinking about what's the best technology to import. And that's really as far as we got with the work. I think there's scope for a lot more work to be done about this, actually. And the technology landscape is moving so fast, and the accessibility and cost and so on implications are also moving really quickly. And it's often younger people who are in the forefront of this that I think it's something that needs to be looked at very, very hard. But it was kind of outside the scope of our primary research.
Great. Okay, thanks for that. And I know some people are probably going to be dropping off for the next calls or next meetings or other events. But for those who can stay on the line, that would be great. And maybe Nick, we can hand over to you to talk about the next steps and how we're moving forwards after this initial step.
Thanks, Karimi. And appreciate that we've gone over the hour. So those of you who are not at 8 o'clock at night, like we are here, or Kirsty is even later in Fiji, may have to run to other meetings. So we're absolutely delighted to have this phenomenal output from John and his team at ODI to give us really the basis on which we're going to move ahead. Time is of essence at the moment. The program, the CNA Foundation funding, goes until the end of the year. So the next step is going to move fairly quickly. We've contracted, or the ARO have contracted TANGO, a consulting firm based out of Bangkok, who are going to take up the mantle from ODI and really going to flesh out this tool. So the suggestion at the moment, or what we have within that proposal, is that 2 countries will be field testing this initial tool. At the moment, penciled in, Rochelle, I can see you on the line here, are the Philippines and Bangladesh. But then also, of course, we want to speak with the other CNA countries or CNA project-funded countries, which is India, China, and I think I'm missing another one in this region. Anyway, we will look at rolling out Brazil. Oh yeah, there's Brazil and Mexico. I thought there was another Asian one, but we'll focus.
There's 3, Nick.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So we'll be looking to roll it out in 2 of the countries to have the TANGO teams actually go and work alongside the program teams to test the tool, but then also the possibility of rolling it out remotely in 3 other countries. The objective of which will really to be test the approach that they will put together for us based on all this research, based on further conversations with many of you. And by the end of the year to have tested and then refined and completed what I think will be the first phase of a real rollout tool. And that's not to say it's going to be set in stone, a rollout testing tool, because we know that these things, different contexts will need different adaptations. But we will, I think, between now and the end of the year, be able to put something together that you'll be able to start using in your country offices. So what we really want to hear from all of you is that those of you who are interested and able to engage in this first phase of testing between now and mid-December, to get hold of Karimi and myself and let us know about the availability. We'll also go out directly to the countries that I mentioned to provide the inception report from TANGO, which outlines some of the time frames that they're hoping to follow, which will give you a bit of an idea of when they want to do the field work or when they will need to do the field work to be able to hit the timelines. So hopefully by the end of the year, what we'll have is something that is, it's not going to be complete. Hopefully a tool like this, due to its nature, will be ever evolving. There will be other tools that will be developed by others. And the whole idea is to put something together that can accommodate the new thinking, the new tools, the new approaches, and support, as John has outlined, that process, that thinking, that decision-making that needs to go behind the use of any HVCA tool to be able to get some sort of an output. So that's the plans as such, and we're really keen to engage with as many of you as possible in this initial period, but then also this will keep going for much longer in the years ahead. I think for any of you who are doing business development or writing proposals, please consider putting time and money into those proposals to be able to further use, trial, develop, and adapt the tool which will come out of this first bit of work. And I'll leave it at that, unless there's questions.
Nick, yeah, it's Christoph here. I just have a short question. Maybe you don't yet have the answer, but is the idea to use the tool in an ongoing existing project so that you can inform the project and see how it works, or have it that sort of separate and standalone piece of research?
I think in an ideal world, it will be to inform the project. One of the reasons why Bangladesh and Philippines have been flagged is they've just got new projects coming online, but just because they have new projects doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be able to tie in the timing. So we're a little bit stuck between the pragmatic side of, you know, where there are staff, time, facilities, programs, and the ability to run it as to be able to actually use it in a program. So we're going to do the best we can. I know that a lot of the CNA project countries are coming towards the end of the programs. So whether we can be able to tweak it in is a bit of an inline type exercise would be interesting. But then again, as you all know, an inline is only as good as the baseline you did beforehand. And because this is new, there won't be exact comparative data, but there may be some qualitative data that can be drawn out of it in part of that final sort of evaluation of the programs that have been running for the last couple of years.
Okay, thanks.
Nick, I have a question. Hello.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as you mentioned that we will be testing a few of the tools. So, did we, have any rubrics like who will be administering these tools? Is this our own staff, or it will be outsourced agencies? And then what are the basic protocols to be followed when we are selecting the investigators, and what should be their experience, knowledge in administering these tools? Because the outcome of the tools, ultimately the findings will all depend upon the type of data collection we are having through these investigators.
Thanks, Manish. Good question and good points. One part of the answer is we'll be relying to a certain extent on the team from TANGO to provide some of that input. To your, I think it was, the first part of the question on will it be Save the Children staff? Because we have quite limited time, and this is something that is funded by a donor and we have to report on the donor. Yes, we'll be doing it through Save the Children programs and Save the Children staff, because that's where we have the greatest influence. If other organizations or individuals put their hand up and say we want to do it in parallel, then fantastic, that would be wonderful. And as I said before, this is will be a first step. We recognize the time frames, and I truly believe that this is something that we can collectively all work on further refining and testing in a greater number of contexts not only in Asia, but further afield over the months and years ahead to see whether our assumptions or the assumptions that will be made are true or false, and the issues that we were talking about earlier on how do we put those boundaries in place for individual or collective risks, the issues of children as agents in change and all of this. I think it's going to be partially a learning process as well, but hopefully we'll collectively be able to keep the momentum going in the foreseeable future.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks for that, Nick. And I guess also in terms of next steps following this, so we will be sharing the report and the research into practice brief that was mentioned by John as soon as possible. The toolkit or the matrix of different tools is actually being developed alongside this new project, and so we won't really share anything externally until that element is done. But we'll share it with a small sort of internal group of people who are interested. And maybe I just wanted to once again thank John for the really informative webinar, and thank everyone. I think we've got people who've dialed in from Asia, Eastern Southern Africa, and also Latin America for this call, which I guess shows the interest from across the organization, and it's really tackling something that we're all working on. So many thanks for everybody who's joined at all the different timelines.
Thank you.
And thanks to John as well. And so we'll be in touch and the next steps, and really want to engage, Shiana as well. Thanks, Kirsty. Engage everyone as much as possible in this. Thanks all.